there was a finding in one of your studies. I wanted to ask you about this. I was speaking with Dr. Matthew Nagar, who's been on the show, that is very across your research. It's a 2014 paper, I think it was, the Vegetarian Dietary Patterns and Mortality in Adventist Health Study 2. So a very widely cited paper. And in that analysis, vegetarians had significantly less lower risk of all-cause mortality than non-vegetarians. What I found interesting was that vegans, when they were looked at male and females together, it was almost significant, but it wasn't. But then when you looked at males and females separately, male vegans did have significantly less risk of premature death during that study follow-up period, but the females didn't. And then I read a little further and I saw that once you adjusted for BMI, then vegans combined, there was lower all-cause mortality. And I was wondering how we interpret that. Is it possible that the women or the female vegans, there was a number of them that were possibly underweight, which was, driving the non-significant finding that you saw before adjusting for BMI?
Yeah, that's possible, and we haven't, looked specifically at that, but it certainly raises that question. But I'll just point out that in our newer study, and 2014, that might have been a preliminary paper even from our newer study, but a later update, interestingly, does not place being a vegan as the best choice. And I think even in that paper, you'll find that the group that did best of all were the pesco vegetarians. Then the lactose did nearly as well, and then the vegans. And our neuroanalysis really confirms that. We're not finding that the vegan, either men or women, are doing significantly better than the non-vegetarians. Now, these are all Adventists, so that's the non-vegetarians, remember, are still a health-conscious group. But we're finding that the pescos and the lactose seem to be doing best of all. Having said that, the men do continue to do better than the women as vegetarians. Interestingly, in the black subjects, of which we have about 26,000, they're vegans, and particularly the vegan men and women actually seem to be doing much better. It seems to be a better choice for black subjects, but not necessarily the best choice for white subjects.
That's interesting. So How does that inform the advice that you would give someone, and perhaps the advice that you would give yourself and your own food choices, and what might explain why pescatarians and lacto-ovo-vegetarians are doing significantly better than non-vegetarians, but the vegans are not?
Yeah, well, that turns out to be a very complicated question, a very interesting one that we're still in the middle of. We've published a couple of papers in the last 2 years which are somewhat relevant to this, but can only explain a little part of it. And that is, in our data at least, we find that dairy consumption, particularly dairy milk, is an adverse risk factor for both breast cancer in women and prostate cancer in men, which are the two commonest cancers in the United States for men and women respectively, apart from skin cancer. And so, that's potentially a big deal. And we're talking about, interestingly, almost milk seeming to be a little pharmacologic, that you see the risks starting to rise at very small doses, a few teaspoons a day, but chronically over many years.
Of milk or all dairy?
Particularly milk. We didn't see an adverse signal for cheese or yogurt, at least not convincing. And it kind of seems to top out at about 2/3 to 3/4 of a cup a day. as if some perhaps metabolic pathway is getting saturated or something like that. The risk stays high, but doesn't rise much higher than that.
What do you think explains the fact that you saw that for milk but not cheese or yogurt? Is it fermentation? Is it just differences in the nutritional properties?
Yeah, we don't know for sure what's going on here, but it is interesting. At least one way that we could explain that is that dairy products do contain some bovine sex hormones. And both of these cancers, prostate and breast cancer, are the two most common hormone-responsive cancers that we know. So it's hard not to think that something might be going on there. And it turns out that the process of making cheese and yogurt, if you look at the data, the sex hormones, the estrogens and so forth in there from bovine sources are less in those dairy foods. So I mean, back to the original question, why I mention this is that when you look at the difference between vegans and, say, lacto-ovos or non-vegetarians, the thing that stands out is the absence of dairy in the vegans. Now, it turns out there's many other things too, because the vegans put other things in the place of that dairy. And so they have more soy and they have more vegetables and a variety of other things. But certainly it drew our attention to dairy. And so that's why we looked at that, because we observed that the vegans had lower risk of breast cancer and lower risk of prostate cancer, whereas the other kinds of vegetarians had no difference from the non-vegetarian Adventists. So we wonder what was different about the vegans. Obviously, dairy.
Right. But isn't that counterintuitive in some ways? Because if we step back, what you were saying earlier was the lacto-ovo vegetarians and pesco vegetarians, they're the ones that there was a significant reduction in total mortality. But you didn't find that for the vegans.
Right.
But then you find this association between dairy and prostate and breast cancer. But despite their consumption of dairy, they're living significantly longer. So is it, how else is dairy affecting health outcomes?
That's why I said it was complicated. And there's another little piece to this argument as well. And that is that when we look in colorectal cancer, we found in our data the same kind of thing that many other cohorts had found, and which is generally accepted as probably true now, that dairy there appears to be somewhat protective. And out of data, when we dug a little deeper, we found that it was probably the calcium in dairy, because we find that calcium from non-dairy sources seems to be protective as well. So we think that partly that could be why the vegans are not doing as well. But the other things that we're starting to wonder about also, and this gets to some data which I can't really talk about too much because it's not published yet, it's just going to press. We find that particularly the vegans and perhaps the lacto-ovos who are nearly vegans, and many of the lacto-ovos have a low dairy, so they're not far from vegans. We're finding in our data a significantly increased risk of some neurological outcomes. And I wouldn't say that's an established finding yet, and it needs to go through peer review, but is starting to concern us a little bit. And we don't understand why, but one of the issues that obviously comes to mind is that when you think of some of the longer chain fatty acids like DHA and EPA, it's the vegans and the lactose who are getting none of that in their diet, zero.
Right, these important omega-3s for brain function physiology.
Well, that's right. I mean, there's a significant amount of brain weight is actually DHAs, the most common fatty acid in the brain, and the brain's a fatty organ. So this could be important. Now, that's not the end of the story, of course, because there is a conversion process from a medium chain omega-3 called linolenic acid to DHA. And there's controversy about that, but it's possible that the conversion of that, which is relatively small, but is nevertheless sufficient for good brain health. And one other piece of this puzzle is that the possible increase we're seeing in the vegans and some of the lacto-vegetarians of these neurological issues is only in the very old people. And it turns out there seems to be a difference between when you're in your 80s or late 70s and when you're in your 50s and 60s. So it all gets very, very complicated, but that is obviously counterbalancing some of the impact that we see of the benefits of a vegan and a conservative lacto-vegetarian on cardiovascular disease, on infectious disease, on chronic renal failure and things of that sort.
That's super interesting.
Yeah.
So that is suggesting that, you rightly pointed out, there's this debate. Can you convert enough ALA into DHA and EPA? Can you eat enough walnuts and flax and chia and get enough DHA and EPA? But what you're saying is there is emerging data. This hasn't been published yet. That is suggesting that people who adopt a strict vegan diet or close to have higher risk of neurological conditions later in life.
That's what our data seems to be suggesting. And in terms of that conversion process from the medium chain to the longer chain, there is competition in the enzymes in the liver that make that conversion between the omega-3 and the omega-6, and perhaps the omega-9, which is the OLAC, the monounsaturated fat. So it turns out that just having a lot of omega-3 linolenic in your diet, which the vegans do, comes from walnut and flax and soy particularly, is not quite enough. Because if at the same time they're having a lot of omega-6, which they do, that competes and diminishes that conversion from the linolenic through to the DHA. So it turns out that actually flaxseed is the very best of all that I'm aware of in terms of that omega-6, omega-3 ratio.
Right. So what you're saying is that your DHA and EPA status could be very much dictated by the overall makeup or quality of your dietary pattern. And if you're consuming a lot of omega-6s, this is something I had a previous guest, Professor Philip Calder, who researches omega-3s and 6s. He spoke to this exactly. Right. If you're eating a lot of, say, omega-6 rich seed oils or ultra-processed foods with a lot of omega-6s, that might be using up a lot of those enzymes that desaturate and elongate the omega-3s to DHA and EPA, and so you might have less conversion, end up with less DHA and EPA, and as a result, be at higher risk of some of these neurological conditions.
And it's interesting when you think of where does all this omega-6 come from. A lot of it comes from very heavily processed vegetarian foods like soft margarines, which we have actually advocated for many years. But the omega-6 that's in the corn and the safflower and some of the others, it's actually there in relatively small quantities. They've had to heavily process it to get that. So, to go back to a question you mentioned before, what would I recommend is the best diet and what do I try to do? It's actually, I think, to put all the evidence together at the moment, it leads you to a low dairy, lacto-ovo-vegetarian diet that still allows some cheese and yogurt, but supplements with vitamin B12, and we haven't talked about that, particularly as you get older, and definitely if you're a vegan. But also, I think potentially includes modest quantities of fish. And as you get older, maybe supplementation with
a DHA, EPA.
And being sure that you have a omega-6, omega-3 ratio, which is around 4. So it all gets a little complicated, but in terms of, just simply explaining it is a relatively low dairy, lacto-vegetarian diet with some fish supplementing with B12, and maybe some flaxseed.
Okay, I have a bunch of questions to dig a little deeper on this stuff. Howdy, friends. The Proof team and I wish you a happy new year, and we're grateful for your ongoing support of our work. As a special thank you, my team and I have created the Living Proof Longevity Challenge, which begins on February 1st. It's a zero-cost, 12-week challenge to build science-backed health habits to optimize your physical and mental well-being, reduce your risk of chronic disease, and help you live longer. Head over to theproof.com/livingproof for more details and to download your copy of the Living Proof Longevity Challenge. Has there been any inquiry into how vegans in this population do if they are supplementing with DHA and EPA? I'm not sure if there is a significant number or if that's data that you've collected. And also, we haven't covered this, but how long on average have the subjects in these studies adopted their particular diet?
Right. No, well, I mean, this is relatively new data for us, and we do have data on supplementation for all of our 96,000 people with fish oils. So, potentially we can look at those who supplement and those who don't, even if they're vegans. We simply haven't done that yet. As far as how long people have adhered to this is, I think, one big advantage that the Adventist population gives us, and that is, and we've published this data, on average, the lacto-ovo-vegetarians and the non-vegetarians have been that for 30 plus years, most of their life. The vegans, somewhat less, but on average in excess of 10 years, and the same for the pesco vegetarians. And I think this is a big advantage because it's a pretty common experience that particularly young people, they will give the vegetarian diet a go for a few years, and but then often they lapse, and it's a problem with other studies of vegetarians, and we collaborate with some. There's not many around the world. That oftentimes the vegetarians they happen to pick up at the time that they begin their study are temporary vegetarians, whereas in our population that's not the case in general. But
do you think there's this potential circumstance where it's possible to kind of over-extrapolate or over-interpret, say, results from your study, looking at vegetarians and vegans with regards to recommending such a diet for, say, someone like me aged in my 30s? If I eat a plant-exclusive diet for my life, that could look like 40, 50 years of doing that, which we just don't have the data on that. So could it be that, say, risks of fracture or sarcopenia are not being borne out in the data because people have just not consumed the diet for long enough? I know that's probably a concern that people from different sort of diet tribes might flag.
Well, I think our data gives a little bit of the light to that, because particularly the lacto-ovo, which is the most common form of vegetarian diet in the Adventist population, and also the non-vegetarian groups, the majority of those have been that way lifelong. The other thing we're finding, interestingly, is that for cardiovascular disease only, not for cancer and for other causes of death, it seems like the impact of the vegetarian diet is particularly evident through the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, but wanes in the 70s and 80s. So if you've survived through to the 70s and 80s, being a vegetarian matters less as compared to being a non-vegetarian for cardiovascular disease. Not true for cancer and for other forms of death. So it seems like for cardiovascular disease, it's particularly premature deaths that we're avoiding. If you're in your 30s and 40s and 50s, I think that's the right time.
Just to double click on omega-3s a little bit more here. So your recommendation based on the data now, it's not perfect data, but there's data there to suggest that a direct source of DHA and EPA is probably a good precautionary approach. And that could be from consuming fatty fish, modest amounts, or supplementing. Do we have reason to believe that a DHA EPA supplement would bring about the same effect on health outcomes as fatty fish?
Yeah, it's a good question. The data, I think, is not very clear on that. And in fact, it's not too clear yet whether supplementation does make a difference to neurologic outcomes. The data is very mixed, although there's sufficient out there now that did seem to show an effect that I think means that we've got to take it fairly seriously. But as far as I'm aware, the comparison between fish and supplementing the long chains, or for that matter, making sure you have only a good quantity of the medium chain omega-3 and not too much omega-6, I mean, that's another option that in theory could work.